All right. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening. I see we're joining Boyega Tokumbo. Thank you for joining. Welcome to the African Governance Institute for Development. This is our first episode of July in our monthly webinars that we hold. And I am extremely excited today, particularly because of the guests we have in-house. I'm always excited, but particularly excited this evening because we have a very, very distinguished personality in our midst, and we will be, starting the webinar immediately. But if you're joining, please tell us where you're joining from. Welcome, Boyega Tokumbo and Yola Ali. It's good to see you. Bolaji Elegbede, thank you. Please let us know where you're joining from. This is, once again, the African Governance Institute for Development, where we are raising value-based leaders that will promote good governance and also nurture active citizenship for national development. Tonight, I have someone that I also just discovered. We went to the same secondary school, which is extremely interesting, as I would say. But tonight we have Mr. Funso Doherty in the house. Please let us make him feel welcome in the comment section. Thank you much for joining us, sir. You are someone that we have watched, and we want to learn more from you tonight. So thank you for being here. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, Seyi. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. So you have been several. You've acted in several capacities. You were in ARM, you're in PAL, in KPMG, Arthur Andersen at the time, and in 2023 you were the ADC gubernatorial candidate for Lagos State. So I would probably best to let you introduce yourself. How would you describe or introduce yourself, sir, so that the audience can probably be better acquainted with you?
Well, thank you for having me, and good evening and welcome to everyone. So my name is Funso Doherty, as you've said. I am a Lagosian, a proud Nigerian.
That's right.
I was born and raised in Lagos, went to school in Lagos, primary through university actually in Lagos. I served in a part of what is now Kogi State, but was part of Kwara State in those days. And I've had my career largely in the area of finance, in the investment management space, mostly. Although I trained as a chartered accountant just out of school. And then ultimately went on to general management and ended up running 3 companies over time as CEO. And have always had an interest in governance and governance type issues. I probably wrote my first article on governance maybe 10 years ago. And that interest just grew over time. And eventually, in around 2020, 2021, I threw my hat in the political ring, as you said, and I ran for office for the governorship of Lagos in the last general elections, as you probably know. And we can speak a little bit more about, how and why I made that transition and what are the factors that drove that decision. But ultimately, it flows from this interest in governance and kind of commitment to how do we make things better. And so that's where I am, and I remain active in governance today, even though I'm not in office. And I'm sure we'll speak more about that as we go along. So that's me. I'm married, and I have 3 kids. My first daughter is 25, and my last son is 14.
All right. Thank you very much. Very, detailed introduction. And like you said, we will get into some of those points you have already pointed out to. I said this earlier on, and if you're just joining us, this is we have tonight with us Mr. Funso Doherty, KCOB, which means if you're from King's College, the great King's College, you'll be proud to know that Mr. Funso Doherty is a KCOB. And I probably haven't greeted you properly, sir. Florian, sir.
Florian.
And the KC haters will be in the comment box
no
saying
problem,
one or
no
two
problem.
things.
We will accommodate them.
All right. Oh, I see Florian Abayo Mishobo Ali. Yes, that's one of my my classmates in KC.
Fantastic.
All right. So let's dive into the conversation.
Yep.
And in 2022, the Ibrahim Index of African Governance showed that 60% of African citizens live in countries where participation, rights, and inclusion is on the decline over the last 10 years. And obviously, this decline has stalled the improvements in good governance. And obviously, that's telling us there is a need to encourage citizens to participate. But interestingly, between 2017 and 2022, the Mo Ibrahim Index report says there's been a surge of protests. So there is decline in participation, rights, and inclusion. But in between 2017 and 2022, there's been a surge in protest across the continent, especially with matters relating to elections, governance, constitutional changes. And the protest has heavily involved young people using their voices to challenge the status quo. Obviously, Nigeria, we're aware of 2020, Nigeria, Guinea, Sudan, and very recently, even Kenya. So probably my first question to you, sir, then is it only protests we can use to make our voices heard as young people?
Well, I mean, obviously not, right? There are different ways in which the voice of the led, as opposed to the voice of leadership, can be made heard. So, when you think about democracy in particular, there's this notion of what is called the narrow corridor. It's called the narrow corridor. And essentially, basically, you have the voice of the people on one hand, and then you have, leadership on the other. And, leadership pushes in one direction and the voice of the people push in the other direction. And ultimately, when things work is when things are in that narrow corridor where there is, the accountability coming from the voices of the people and governance direction and vision coming from the direction of leadership. So there's that balance of power. Now, inevitably, one of the things I think that is reflected in those statistics that you've reeled out, and why you may have that dichotomy between participation declining and protests increasing. One possible explanation might be that people feel that their voices are not heard through the normal channels, right? And if they feel their voices are not heard through the normal channels, then their inclination to participate in the normal channels is reduced. But those voices still have to find a way of being heard, particularly when things, get very difficult. And I think that that may be reflected in those numbers that you see. And ultimately, what we hope for is a functional democracy where voices can be heard and incorporated in governance without descending into a crisis situation, right? Ultimately, that is where we want to be. But the truth of the matter is that if we don't accomplish that, or if we don't have that, then somehow those voices will be heard. And I think that's what we're seeing across the African continent.
Right. So let's talk about and spot on. There are obviously several channels. Now, what channels would you say are probably, if you could say, probably the most effective, or in certain circumstances, what channels, what tools, which ones should we use per time? We have had a webinar in the past where we talked about the protest work. And one of the things we discussed that day is, well, really protest is actually a signal that something isn't working, and there should have been other means of dialogue before then. So let's talk about channels. What are the channels available to us as young people, and is there a particular strategy as to which ones to use per time, in your opinion?
To me, I think that it's not either or. I think it's all of them, right? So I think that they are all valuable and they all play different roles. Now, obviously, right, in a democracy, the basic voice you have is your vote, right? And so that's an important voice to speak through. It's not always the case that our structures, institutions, etc., enable those voices to be heard as clearly and distinctively and truthfully as the people intend. But that's not a reason not to speak through that channel. I think you have to continue to speak through that channel, and then you have to also speak to the structures and institutions of that channel to try and influence them through the normal channels that you think of, such as being involved in the electoral review processes, being involved in civil society, those that influence the process of even passing the electoral laws. All of these things are important, and we must not give up on any of them, because there will be victories that are won not all at once, but gradually, right? And I'm sure we can point to certain victories that were won in the last iteration of the electoral law. And even though in the implementation of all of it, there were a lot of, many would argue that there were a lot of, pitfalls and shortcomings, but some progress was made. And the way democracy works is that progress builds on progress builds on progress. Now, in addition to that, I think that people also have to have the right to demonstrate, for example, when they feel that there's something to demonstrate about. If people feel that the institutional structures and the normal channels need to be augmented by demonstrations, it is a valid component of the democratic process. It is something that should be guaranteed, that people have a right, of peaceful protest. And that also carries its own weight. I think if you think specifically now with a specific example of the NSAS protests, I think that a lot was accomplished as a result of the NSAS protests, right? So there were a lot of things that we can say were very unfortunate about it. Some of the reactions and some of the loss of life and property and casualties, but certain principles were established. The recognition of the young population as a force to be reckoned with came to the fore in a way that people had not thought about in the past. And I would argue that from those foundations, the increased participation that we saw in the last electoral cycle was birthed, right? Because that energy carried over into the electoral cycle, and we saw it play out. And it's something that once kindled, right, can only grow, and we must emphasize it. And you even see now, even in the political class, there's a lot of focus on the young people. People are trying to speak to the young people. So there's that recognition, and the way the young people claimed that, because it wasn't sort of handed to them. They claimed it, right? Was through that power of the voice that was reflected in the NSAS protests.
That's fantastic. I think you've said quite a few things, sir, and definitely what we're emphasizing is that it's all of us. You don't leave accountability to some people. It's what we should all be involved in, and I love the way you started your answer saying it's not one or the other. It's actually understanding that there are different channels and you're using them as you go along. Now let's talk about you a little bit, sir. Your motivations. All right. We have seen your several open letters, and the consistency of your voice in sharing your concerns and all of that. So let's talk about what drives you. Where is the motivation from? How you said it's.
Okay, did I lose you?
Yes, sir. I said talk to us about your motivation. I think I was cut off for a few
Okay,
seconds there.
now you're back. Yes.
All right. Thank you.
Yes. Motivations.
Yes.
So for me, the whole thing is about it's about improving the quality of governance, right? Because at the end of the day, what makes the difference between societies that advance and societies that do not is really in the quality of leadership, in the quality of governance, because that then produces the institutions, the cultures over time, the attitudes, the behaviors, the norms that then drive society. And you either have a virtuous cycle created or you have a vicious cycle. So it's really about how do you create good governance. And getting involved in politics in the first place was actually as a result of the recognition that this has been an area of weakness for us as a country almost since independence, right? So if you look at where we are in relation to where we could have been, we're still grappling with many of the issues that we grappled with pre-independence, actually. And so, and very often you can draw a direct line to quality of leadership and quality of governance. Now, how does governance improve in a democratic setting? There are only two ways. In fact, there's only one way, right? But two aspects to it. People who have the capacity, the intentions, the commitment, the character have to step up and offer themselves for office. And the people whose votes they seek have to support them into office. And through the electoral system, that is how you get to good governance. In a democratic system, that's the only way. I mean, short of going and having a coup or what have you, that is the only way. And so, for me, that sort of drove my stepping into politics. But remember, I said that for almost 10 years, even prior, I had been writing on governance issues, right? So I have also felt, and by the way, I have also supported, in many ways, civil society organizations that have a mandate to sort of improve accountability in governance and all, because I felt it was important to support those entities so that whoever emerges through the political process, there is a check and a balance and a voice seeking transparency so that, it almost sort of helps to guarantee some minimum outcomes if you have an active, voice for accountability. And coming through the elections, I just felt that, look, part of the problem that we have is that, people come out every 4 years for elections. We come out, we have a free-for-all battle and no holds barred kind of thing. And then everybody goes home and goes to sleep for the next 4 years. And very often the people who are in power, who may have emerged through legitimate or illegitimate purposes or processes, then have the lay of the land or the run of the mill for 4 years without accountability. And it seems to me that an important part of getting good leadership is holding them accountable, right? It happens all over the world. So there's this thing about the Egyptian proverb where they went to the pharaoh. Somebody went to the pharaoh and said, "How is it that you became a tyrant?" And he said, "Well, nobody stopped me." Right? So, on some level, there's an element of that. So it should never be said of us that the reason we didn't end up with good governance is because we did not, insist on it. And so I think that it's valuable, even thinking about when I ran companies as a CEO, it was valuable to me to hear from those people who had a different point of view from me. It was valuable. And I actually valued those people. And even in my team now, I have people who are included just for that purpose, because I know that most times they disagree with me. But I want to hear that perspective as well, right? Because it's important for a good leader to be able to then balance and then make a judgment. So for me, this is the motivation. Ultimately, we're trying to get to good governance. You can do it as an active participant in office, in my view, most effectively. But whilst you're not in office, you can also actually contribute to governance. And by the way, as a practical matter, practical experience, I can tell you that some of the things that we've talked about, you can see clearly that they are affecting the actions of government. You can see it, right? Because sometimes we speak about something, and in the next few weeks, you just kind of see the actions that they take, and you know. So, the value, I think, is unquestionable. I think more people need to do it, and I think that at the end of the day, that's an important part. Yes, we focus on the electoral cycle. We must also focus on the accountability question.
Such a great point, sir. Such a great point. I've always, said that when you leave it to just some institutions or the opposition party, as some people would say, you limit the effectiveness.
Yeah.
Because hey, sometimes there could be coalitions that make even the opposition keep quiet. But there's no way you can, have that sort of arrangement with everybody. And that's part of why we do what we do at AGID, where we're trying to educate citizens so that they become active in their role and in their participation within that 4 years, and not go to sleep like you have rightly described. And I love some of the things you said that just points to secure leadership. So, leaders must be secure to be able to have divergent views. They must be secure to be able to understand, it's okay if you don't see it the way I see it. It's perspective, and I think it makes for better decisions. But I want to move further, sir. I speak to quite a number of young or younger people, because I'm still a young man. And the, if you like, consistent comment I hear is, you want us to talk, hey, they will carry us, or how something is going to happen, and then obviously quick to point to NSAS, quick to point to so many things that have happened much more recently. So let's speak to the question of courage. In terms of how do you maybe stay courageous, because that's sometimes the only way to describe it, or how do you manage the risk associated with speaking out against government agencies or those in power or things or people in such positions?
It's a good question. I would say that I don't spend a lot of time thinking about it, to be fair. I'm driven by the fact that I understand that it is needed. I'm driven also by the fact that I understand that there is a gap. And as you've just said, your question itself implies that, there is a dearth of people who are stepping up to play that role, right? So there's no shortage of people who are showing up to seek office or to run for election, right? There's no shortage of people.
No.
Right? There's a shortage of people who are prepared to stay engaged, raise their voice when there's need to raise the voice, not just for the purpose of raising the voice, and not also when it is politically expedient to speak on a matter. Because there are matters it's important to speak on, which may actually not be politically expedient, and there are some of those that I've spoken on, that people have even advised me, politicians have advised me that, politically, this is not something that, you should spend a lot of time talking about, but it's important to talk about it, right? So I think that, it's like I said, I don't spend a lot of time thinking about it. Maybe I've also not had bad experiences. But I think that our democracy is maturing. I think that I actually think that the system is becoming more, maybe not receptive is the word, but it's more accommodating of voices, right? So you see people speak out more, I think, these days. So even if you just watch like a Rise or what have you, people share their viewpoints, and I think there's a recognition that in a democratic setting, that is part of the rules of the game. I think culturally, so I think part of the constraint is a cultural constraint where, in a sense, there's this concept of something called the power distance. I don't know if you're familiar with the or the concept of power distance, but people who have studied cultures across the globe, sometimes measure cultures by something they call the power distance, one measure of a culture, right? So that is the distance that exists or is perceived to exist or exists in people's behavior between those that are in power and those that are not in power. In other words, like a CEO and the clerk, for example, in the office. What is the power distance that exists between those two people? And if you compared it, for example, in the United States of America, and compare the same sort of difference CEO to clerk in Nigeria, you will find that the power distance in Nigeria is much greater than in the US. Do you see what I mean?
Sure.
Just in terms of what the clerk feels they can say to the CEO, or how they can interact with the CEO, how they can relate to the CEO. And part of that is cultural. Even if you take the Yoruba word for an Oba, what is it? What is it? Kabiesi, isn't it?
Kabiosi, yes. Kabiesi.
Yes, Kabiesi, which is Kabiosi. That is someone who cannot be questioned.
Yes.
Right. So part of it is intrinsic as well. So we have to break out of that in a way. And sometimes also, when you speak authoritatively, you speak factually, right? And you speak publicly. That in itself is a form of protection, right? Because you're not doing things behind you are speaking out, you are speaking factually, you're not denigrating people, you're not slandering people, you're speaking, so it's sort of, it's something that it is difficult to come against forcefully. You see what I mean? Without being you're not on the streets necessarily, you are essentially having a factual discussion. And people can only then engage with you back, but they may not have the facts to back it up, so they will keep quiet.
So I'm going to talk about the facts very shortly, but as you were speaking, the power distance, even in families,
Yes.
It's much, and possibly shows why young people are speaking up. I remember my late boss used to say that in his own days, when his father comes in and they hear his sandals at the door, everybody runs away. But in his own time, his youngest daughter at the time was maybe about 18.
Yes.
When was much younger than that, when he's at the door and he's sort of shaking his leg so they know he's coming, they're like, "Oh, you're making noise, you're making noise. We're watching TV, making noise." And that just shows, like, culture is changed drastically. So
it's a different world.
Totally. And I think it's important to emphasize here, for all of us, that if Mr. Funso Doherty that speaks up and regularly and publicly is telling you that, two things I heard you say. It's almost like, your convictions are greater than your fears. You're not even thinking about this thing. You have to speak up, and so you speak up. I certainly heard that very, very clearly. But even saying democracy is maturing. So I think you have heard it here, that please, if you do have something to say, and use facts, use things, you're not slandering people, you're not trying to, misinform or slander anyone, then speak with facts. I think your voice certainly can be heard and will be heard. So again, like I said, your several letters, and you talked about facts. Are there other practical tips we should have in mind when we are speaking? You already almost started to answer this question. So you've mentioned facts for one, but are there
Yeah.
other things that are important, practical tips to craft impactful messages so that when we speak with authority and we speak with a way that government starts to respond?
Yeah. So I mean, I can't purport to be the be all and end all of this, but maybe I'll just speak to what has worked for me or the approach that I have adopted. And what I've tried to do is when I feel like there's something to speak about. First of all, avoid trying to speak on everything, because then you become sort of
Noisemaker.
a noisemaker, right? You're tuned out. So so that's the first thing. Then secondly, we talked about being factual. I would say also avoid, as a personal style, I try to avoid hyperbole, this like hyperbolic language that often characterizes political speech. Because again, the natural reaction to that is that, it's a politically driven speech. Do you see what I mean?
Sure.
And so people do not, engage with the content because of the way in which you have presented the content, right? So avoid those over the top, I tend to avoid those over the top, political hyperbole. Use data where possible, and not a deluge of data, but data sparingly, effectively, to make a point, and not for the use of data's sake, right? Be measured in your approach. Also be balanced and fair, right? So that people do not, pigeonhole you as someone who is, only seeing one side of things or what have you. And then, try to be balanced both as to the tone of your communication. And, people have different tones. So I'm not asking everyone to sound alike, right? So maybe the way I write is maybe also a function of, who I am and kind of thing. But so it's important also to be authentic. But, so for example, if for example, let me just use an example that people might relate to. So if, the FCT minister, for example, made a statement in the manner and tone in which I write my own letters, right? People probably doubt that he wrote the letter. This is what I mean, because this is what I mean, that authenticity is important, right? So he has his own way of communication. It's effective in his own sphere. Do you see what I mean? So it's also important to also have that, voice of authenticity. But in terms of tone, in terms of frequency, these are the things that that characterize my approach, and I think that that's one of the things that people resonate with, right? So it's there's no shortage of people sort of making political statements and lambasting and all of. There's no shortage of that. People get it all the time, but something that people can read, assess, make a judgment about, and so on. And it's not everything that I write that people agree with. There are many things that people they have a different point of view, and it's fine.
All right, thank you. Now, if you have questions, please do drop them in the comments box. In another 5 to 10 minutes maximum, we will start to take questions from the comments box. So please do drop your questions. I would normally tell people, as a lawyer, if someone were to say 10 things and 9 were correct and 1 was false or incorrect, I would spend all my time on the one incorrect and use that to discredit the remaining 9 that may be true. And
Yes.
and that's why if you're not sure about it, don't put it in there. Just make
Yes.
sure you're dealing with facts and you're not going to allow just that one thing or that hyperbole or exaggeration make your whole speaking up trivialized. All right,
Yes.
so let's move on.
And by the way, it's not only lawyers, politicians are mastered in that thing you've talked about. Especially certain politicians who we shall not name.
Okay, so I love this because you've been very practical in terms of how we can use our voice. One of the things I would normally tell people as well is build communities. Sort of, it's almost you have a voice, and people would easily argue with me, oh, he has a platform, or is established. As a young person, I don't have a platform. Who's going to listen to me? How are they going to hear my voice? My voice doesn't count, so to say. So how can young people build collective voices that is more likely to be heard? And I think that is something from where where young people are starting from. That we don't have that platform yet. So
yeah.
how can young people build that?
So it's a good question. The first thing I will say is that ultimately not everybody will, just as in life, not everybody will have the same sort of, ability to develop that voice or that impactful voice or what have you, right? People are effective in different ways. So some people, it's not about voice. Maybe there are other ways in which they are gifted, right, to impact the system, right? But if you look at the space today, even the governance space, the political space, actually any space, right? There are young voices in every space, right? So if you wanted to, for example, find young people who were politically influential in social media, they exist.
Sure.
They have built up their voices over time, and they've come to become acknowledged to be an influential voice in political matters, even though they're young. You see what I mean?
Sure.
So it's about, it's about reaping where you have sown. So in a sense, they have sown in a particular place. Maybe they are gifted in that, in that sense of being connectors or what have you. And then they have used their voice. Maybe they are skilled communicators. Maybe they're just personalities that are naturally that people are naturally drawn to or what have you. The life people in social media are not necessarily different from people in real life. You know what I mean? People have personalities, they have characters that play out, in those places. So I think that and the same things that work, authenticity, people feeling being, if you're informative, for example, that's a big one, right? So if you're giving people information that they did not otherwise have, if you think about some of the things, if I think about some of the communications that we've put out, right, that have been most impactful, right, it's not necessarily the ones that have been most kind of had the most deep analytical insights or what have you, or even necessarily the ones that spoke about the most egregious things, but it's the ones that just brought out things that people are not aware of. You know what I mean? So it's just like the informative part of people are eager and hungry, to learn about some of these things. And when they do, it helps. So if you can be informative in your communications, that also is a way of amplifying your voice, right? Do you see what I mean? So so these are things I think that we can do at the individual level. But I think also as communities, one of the things that's important to do, and it's tough to engineer, but again, that's why the notion of influencers is quite important and valuable, is that the power of the collective voice is so much stronger than. So, for example, when you talk to me now about my voice and this and that, this whole conversation that we're having.
Sure.
If it was just me saying certain things that nobody sort of rallied around, we probably would not be having this conversation, right? But to the extent that, there are communities that gather around, these messages and amplify them by adding their own voice, creating a dialogue around them and so on and so forth, that then becomes a powerful force. And government actually, has to take that seriously. So, there are two courts, as you know, you're a lawyer, right? So
Yeah.
there's the court of the courts, and then there's the court of public opinion, isn't it?
That's
Right. So yeah, so those, and there are two valid courts. The court of public opinion is as valid a court as the legal court, right? Sometimes more so from the purpose from the perspective of a politician, you know what I mean, and from the perspective
Sure.
of a leader and government, right? Because they're interested in or they are sensitive, right, to what is going on, to that collective voice, and the louder it gets, the more sensitive they have to become to it. You see what I mean? So realizing that collective voice is important, and getting behind. Not everybody will be the person that comes out to speak publicly, but being part of a community that is lending voice, lending support, I think is important, because ultimately, the person who speaks is as influential as the constituency that they represent, in a sense.
Absolutely. Fantastic. And I think it's important to stress, even Mr. Funso Doherty has communities that support his messages. So lest you think I don't have a platform or this, even those that have platforms have communities, and that's why it's so important. And you had alluded to this earlier on when you said you were supporting CSOs, civil society, you were already supporting. So even when it's not your voice, you're backing some of those voices that are speaking, that are in alignment with what you want to say. Because I also guarantee you, there are many young people that say, no, you won't use my own voice, because they're not aligned with you, and they don't want to speak up, or maybe they don't feel as strong about it. So you have to look for communities or build communities that will, speak to the matters that are important to you. So I think we'll go into the questions. I have one or two more questions, but I want to allow the questions from the audience. My team will put up the questions on the screen, and please feel free to just take them one by one, sir, and we'll take it from there.
How can voices be heard when identity of citizens is lumped into one and not given the opportunity to be involved based on their identity, just like the UK does with Wales, Scotland, and Ireland? So this is like speaking to marginalization of groups within a nation.
Yeah, you're almost classing everybody as the same, and not recognizing their different identities. I presume that's how I
so I think he's speaking, my sense of it is that he's speaking about, basically when groups are lumped together and given an identity, and then sort of not given voice, or not given due recognition, or perhaps marginalized in a society. And well, I mean, it's a feature of society that's existed in antiquity, in a sense, right? Because anywhere you have multi-ethnic or multifarious societies, the notion of, is one person more equal than the other has often reared its head, right? And these are issues that they have to be, obviously, the notion of a nation is that all the citizens should be sort of created equal, right? And they should all have equal rights. And to the extent that's the notion of a nation, right? Sometimes we find that, the aspiration of a nation is higher, sometimes far higher than our reality as a nation. And I think this is one of the things that we struggle with in Nigeria, And I think, quite frankly, we've struggled with it even pre-independence, in the colonial era, and so on. And some of the colonial era, by the way, fostered many of those things and actually actively, caused those prejudices, to be brought to the fore. And it's remained an Achilles heel for us as a nation. It's something that we'll have to find a way of surmounting. It's not an easy thing. And I don't have easy answers, but what I always tell people, because at the end of the day, sometimes when you get into political space, when it suits people for political advantage, they resort to this notion of marginalization and ethnicity and so on. But for those that are in control of the system and are using it for the wrong purposes, when you get into those groups, those ranks, you'll find that ethnicity is very low in terms of what the things they think about, right? It's like they're all there, and ethnicity is they're there, sharing money or whatever, and nobody's thinking too much about, is this man from my part of the country or that man from my part of the country, So I think that there are no easy answers. I think that we have to collectively make a decision that we want to put good governance ahead of parochial considerations. And if enough of us make that judgment, make that decision, then we're on our way to making that transition. It's a complex topic, but this is kind of the thought that I would have around it.
Okay, thank you very much. Next question.
What can one do if one's political ideology does not have the numbers? Numerically, victory is an illusion. Should one abandon it and follow a strong majority? So the notion of, you see, the thing about democracy at the end of the day is that it is it's not a perfect system, and political ideology, and I'm assuming, I'm using political ideology in the context of functional democracies, because many would argue that our politics does not operate on the basis of ideology in Nigeria. But generally speaking, political ideology is on a spectrum, right? And if you take countries that operate the kind of political system that we do, which is what is called the first past the post system, right? In other words, the person who got the most number of votes, even if he doesn't get majority, gets the office, right? You can get the office with 30% if you got the one that got the most votes, right? And so that's how you end up in a House of Assembly with all the members coming from one party. Do you see what I mean? Even though 40% of that population in that constituency may actually support somebody else. Do you see what I mean? But in such systems, often you will see that there's a transition of the system towards a two-party state, right? Because that first past the post means that for you to be relevant, you really have to have bulk, right? And that's a global phenomenon. It's not just a Nigerian phenomenon. It's a global phenomenon. And so I think in a way, we also have to understand that for the most part, size is going to be important for political relevance. And if you feel very strongly about an ideology that is a niche ideology, you're going to have to make a choice. You're either going to remain in the niche ideology, or you're going to essentially seek through some coalition or what have you to be part of a larger thing that has the potential, to acquire a leadership position and then influence from the inside. It's just a choice that you have to make. It's a practical matter, and that's a personal choice that people will make. So I think the reality of it is that, if you're going for president, for example, in a country, and you are in a party that has, and you have a support base that is like 5% or 10% of the country, then that's not going to be. It's just not going to happen, right? And you just have to realize that.
All right. Thank you very much, sir. Do we have the next question? I think we're.
With the just concluded Supreme Court ruling granting financial autonomy to LGs and the presidency having closed door meetings with governors, how do you think you can engage the LGs to ensure accountability and promote infrastructure development within the states? So the truth of the matter is that, sometimes, we feel very strongly about tinkering with the system and the arrangements and all of that. And some of those things are important, right? So it's important that states cannot muscle the LGs out, that they cannot disband local government councils willy-nilly, and all of those things are very important. But granting LG autonomy is a necessary but not a sufficient condition for good governance, right? Because many of the issues that you may complain about at the state level can be transferred to the local government level, right? The resources may flow to the local government, and the things you're complaining about at the state level, you start to complain about at the local government level. If leadership is needed at the state level, it is also needed at the local government level. And the quality of leadership becomes that much more important. So hopefully what might happen, and what we hope will happen, as LGs become autonomous and have more resources at their disposal, is that those offices themselves become more attractive to people who have the capacity and the intention and so on and so forth. Then there'll be more sort of a focus on those offices, and therefore, hopefully, the quality of leadership in those offices will rise with the degree of resources that they have under their control. But the same way we have to push for good governance at the national level, state level, we will have to push for good governance at the local government level. We should not assume that because the resources are close to the people, that those resources are going to be well managed or managed for the benefit of the people, or that those public trusts that those offices represent will be discharged effectively. I don't think we can assume that. I think that this whole notion of accountability, holding them to account at the LG level now, you have to hold them accountable from the state level, right? So the state government also needs to ensure that the local governments, who now have a substantial part of the resources, are using those resources, right, to fill the gaps within the society, complementary to whatever the state is in a position to do, or the state is doing. And the people, on the other hand, have to hold their local governments accountable, their state governments accountable. Maybe a bit easier at the local government because it's closer to the people, right? So maybe that will help in that sense. But let's understand that this is just one block in the building blocks that we need to put together. Let's not get too excited and celebratory. Let's think about, okay, now that we've accomplished and achieved this, what are the ancillary things that we need to now push for, insist on, or see that are in place to ensure that the value that is supposed to accrue from this bringing of resources closer to the people, in fact, plays out.
Thank you very much for that answer. I thought that was very brilliant because, it was the same sort of conversation we had when they said we should move to parliamentary system of government. We should. So tinkering the system alone will not solve it. I mean, we're also having conversations on, should INEC be the one to conduct the elections, and any system, once the people in the systems are not of the right values and competence, almost the system will self-destruct, if you
Yeah.
like. So
Yes.
I think it's important to state that these are good wins, but the quality of people that are also going into the offices is also very important. Thank you very much for that. So I think we have just a few more questions to go before we end it tonight.
How do we amplify that collective voice? How do we increase engagement of citizens in the process of democracy? Well, I mean, I think that I don't think there's a silver bullet around this. I think that some of the work that you are doing, a part of what we are doing here this evening, is part of it, and getting people, getting people to buy into, understand, engage in, contribute to these discussions. And we all have our ecosystems around us. We all have our nodes of influence. Everybody who is on this call has a number of people that they impact, a number of centers of influence, right? So I think that there's a network effect that happens, when we start to build on these understandings. And technology and social media has been great actually in amplifying voices. It's in fact one of the things that it does is to amplify voices, much louder than actually the numbers of people that we're talking about, right? From a votes perspective, right? So if you went by what was going on in the social media, and you sort of wrote an election result based on what was going on in social media and the noise level, it would be a very different thing from what actually turned out to be the case. But the noise level is important, right? Because the noise level affects governance. It affects what government does, because it affects how government wants to be perceived, and so on and so forth. So that is always important. So we must keep that up. We must sustain that. Those who are speaking will speak. Those who are engaging will engage. And whatever role we see to play in that part of it, I think is important. Is important to play. I think that we must never turn our backs on the actual electoral process, however much we feel, hard done by, or, sort of cheated, or what have you. We must never turn our back on that. We must never, right? Because ultimately, that is the instrument. That is the instrument of change. And the key is not to be discouraged. The key is to understand what were the pitfalls this time. How do we sort of fix those in the next cycle, and so on and so forth. Participation is important. Citizens have to be engaged. Now, citizens are very disengaged. If you take my state, for example, in Lagos has the lowest number of votes, the lowest voter turnout nationally. I'm sure you're aware, right?
Yes, sir.
So in our governorship elections, for example, people vote. Total votes is maybe 15% if you're lucky of the electorate, whereas nationally it's about 30% on average, and in some states you see it, maybe even up to 40 or what have you. So a lot of that is the point you made earlier about the Mo Ibrahim thing and people, and because if you look at Lagos, you will see that participation actually has been declining with each election cycle. So it actually typifies that thing that you spoke about, right? But people must remain engaged. We must ensure that we're speaking. People have to believe that there are still people who are engaged in the system, that they can identify with, and we have to keep struggling to keep people in the system. So, voice, accountability, but also the electoral process, all are important.
Thank you very much. I think three more questions. Can we have the next one? We're starting to round up.
Is freedom of speech truly guaranteed in Nigeria with the current happenings? Not every voice has the capacity and resources to speak. So what do you feel can be done to have a voice? Well, I think I've spoken a little bit about this in the earlier question. Is freedom of speech truly guaranteed? Not about guaranteed, but I think that people can speak in Nigeria. Actually, people can speak. We're not yet in that place where if somebody says something against government, they come and pick him up the next day, and you don't see him again for two or 3 years. That kind of thing. People speak in Nigeria. They may ignore you. They may they may castigate you. But voices, there are voices out there. Again, not all voices, as you have rightly noted, have the volume or the impact, but that is natural, right? It will never be the case that all voices have the same impact. The more you become a valued voice, using some of the things that we talked about earlier, the more you become an informative voice, the more you become an influential voice, the more impact you will have. And I think that there are examples we can point to today, not just, a lot of young people actually are very influential, and politicians actually seek them out, to get their opinions, to get their endorsements, and so on and so forth. And these are people who, are just young people who have developed a voice. They've sold into that thing, and they're reaping the benefits of it. Part of the thing about voice, and let me just say this, part of the thing you have to think about and know as when you have a voice is that with it comes responsibility. And you have to, it's an asset that you have to guard, and you have to guard it jealously. And just like reputations, it can be built over many years and destroyed, in a day, right? So that's also important. You have to realize that when you're a voice, there's a responsibility you carry to those people who essentially are your constituencies or your tribe, right? And you're in a position of trust in a sense, and you have to understand that and reflect that, and not use that podium, or not misuse that podium. Let's put it that way.
Wow. Thank you very much. With your voice, having a voice with the privilege also brings great responsibility, and I think that was a very important point to state. So thank you very much. Yep. All right.
Joanna Coker, does Mr. Doherty, Joanna? Okay, hi Joanna. I know Joanna. Does Mr. Doherty have an explanation for the impunity with which our leaders behave? The country is on its knees, so why do they continue to be seen to be reckless with our limited resources? Again, I don't have an explanation, but the thing is that when people feel that they can get away with it, then that's where impunity arises from. It's the lack of consequences. And as a society, we have to ask ourselves, how do we get to the point where the system is so captured that those that are in control of it, can have a sense of impunity or a sense of lack of accountability. Because the structures themselves have built-in mechanisms of check and balance, right? They do. The problem is that the problem is never that we don't have laws usually, right? You're a lawyer. I mean, you probably know that we have a robust body of laws, right?
Absolutely.
Now one of the things is, for example, when people in authority break the law, what happens? So there's a particular thing now that we are challenging where, we're actually commencing a legal action, right? Because we feel that laws have been broken by actually more than one government agency in a particular large contract that government awarded. And we feel it's a blatant thing and so on and so forth. So we're taking action, we're going to court, right? That was not our first course of action, right? So we did the usual thing that we would do, would write letters, we would write this and all of that. But again, in our view, and I must say this is in our view, there's an impunity associated with that as well. I mean, people feel they can get away with it. And so you take the next step, which essentially is to challenge it through the institutional process and the institutions that exist. And you test the institutions. Because at the end of the day, when democracies grow and develop, it is because the institutions of democracy have been operated, tested, brought forward, and they've matured. So let's not get very discouraged when we see things that we think are, there's this sense of powerlessness, right, that comes, and we mustn't succumb to it. We must look for ways in which we can continue to pull that level of accountability. Sometimes it will involve court of public opinion. Sometimes it will involve the actual courts. But whatever it is, let's use what we have. Let's use what we have. Let's carry on, because it is what is it that they say, that all that is required for evil to thrive is that good men do nothing.
Can I take this opportunity to thank you, sir, for being a model, being not just a model, a champion of good governance. It's interesting because obviously going to courts, you will obviously pay fees, you will probably hire lawyers. Just the same way your newspaper adverts, I bet they're not free. They're paid for. So, just being a model of someone championing good governance, I think it's definitely noteworthy and remarkable. And we really want to thank you. And I love the comment you just made now. Test the institutions. You have to test the institutions. We make so many assumptions. It's not working. They will come after me. But here you have in front of you, Mr. Funso Doherty, that he's not just speaking, he's actually doing, walking the talk and testing the system and doing all of these things. And I think it's very important. I would probably just allow for one last question. But I know maybe we have about two more, so I'll maybe just the one, and then we will start to wrap it up from there. So just probably a final question, and then your final words, and we'll take it off.
How can we balance individual voices with collective decision-making in governance? Individual voices with collective decision-making in governance. And a more personal question, where do you see Nigeria in the next 15 to 20 years? Okay, let me just bring out my crystal ball, please. Individual voices with collective decision-making in governance. I mean, I guess there are different perspectives that one can take this question. I'm not sure exactly the perspective in which it is asked, but, collective decision making. Government is a collective exercise, and the quality of government, much like the quality of leadership of any substantial enterprise, is a function of the good faith, good intentions, capacity, knowledge, and collective capacity of the decision-making unit. But very importantly, the head of that structure has a disproportionate influence on the outcome of the entire system, right? And it is very difficult. It is very difficult to get good governance right, particularly in an early democracy like Nigeria, if you have the wrong type of person at the head of the whole thing, because they say the fish rots from the head. You see, in a very developed system where institutions are very strong, the influence of that person at the apex of the system is not as great, right? And if you get the wrong person in there for a while, the institutions will cage that person, and they'll muddle along for a while until the guy gets out of there, right? The system will not collapse. But that's because that system has been built through good leadership over a long period of time to get to that level. So it's very important that the person at the head of that system has the right intentions, the right motives. Because if you have the right motives and you have reasonable intelligence, even if you don't have all the capacity, you will bring in the right capacity to support your person because you have the right intentions. Right? So that thing is so critical. And I think that, sometimes we shy away from saying it. Sometimes we shy away from, this idea that let's just look for somebody who can walk. Let's not worry if the person is a thief or whatever, that, let's just, that, it's just a fallacy, right? Because if you look at countries that have developed, countries that have high GDP per capita, countries that are prosperous and successful, they all share this thing where the leadership of those countries, generally are acting in good faith. And the bad faith actors are the exception, in many cases, the rare exception to the rule. And until you start moving the system in that direction, sustainable development will be very difficult to come by. So I think that whilst you may have, this notion of individual voices and collective decision making is really all about blending it all together. But to blend it all together, you need the people who are in control of the system, and most importantly, the person at the apex of the system, to have the right combination of competence, capacity, and character, most importantly. Where do I see Nigeria in the next 15 to 20 years? I feel that we're at a crossroads, but I'm optimistic. You may say cautiously optimistic, not wildly optimistic, and I think there's reason to be optimistic. I think that I see more and more people who have a heart to do the right thing, looking for how they can get involved in the process, looking for how they can engage the system. We see some of them already in the system. And I see more of that. I saw it in the last election cycle. I think we will see more of it in the coming election cycle. And I think that, it's a trend. It's a trend. And like many trends, I think it may start slow, but at some point, it reaches a tipping point. And I think that is going to happen. I think it's going to happen. And you know, things that I am doing, I'm not alone. There are people who are engaging in the system, in different ways. One of the problems that we have had historically is that people who are of a certain type have felt comfortable going into appointive offices rather than elective offices. So they are more comfortable being appointed a minister by somebody to come and work as a minister for 4 years, right? You maybe came from the private sector, did very well in the private sector, is very smart, hardworking, comes and works very hard for 4 years, and then goes back to the private sector, right? But 2 years after that person leaves that place, you ask what is the impact on the system, and it's very minimal, right? They did a lot when they were there. They worked hard, but at the end of the day, their capacity to impact the system, a lot of the time, resides in elective offices. And what I am seeing is more of an interest by people who you would ordinarily think of as, being more of the line of appointive offices, now getting into the game for elective offices, which is where the lasting institutional change, in my opinion, can be made. And that's why I'm optimistic about Nigeria for the next 15 to 20 years. And I think that each of us should just look for a way to be a part of that process. We will not all run for office. We will not all be active in the political space. But we can be engaged, we can be informed, and we can support communities, people, candidates that we feel comfortable with and that we think will move us in the right direction.
Wow, absolutely fantastic answers. Leaders are always optimistic, and I love the way you answered that question. And on this note, we have come to the end. There is a survey link in the comment section. Please do fill it out to help us serve you better. While Mr. Doherty gives us his final remarks, please do click on the link and help us to help you better. So your final thoughts, sir. You have said so much, and we're sincerely grateful to have you on this platform tonight. The entire team at AGID really appreciate your time, and I'm sure everyone listening, whether now or later on YouTube, will certainly have appreciated the level of wisdom and dexterity by which you've handled all of these questions. But before you go, your parting words about our voice, how the future and our voice.
So first of all, I want to thank you for having me. I've thoroughly enjoyed this engagement, and I want to encourage you, because I think what you're doing is in a sense is God's work. Because at the end of the day, the more that we have people who understand that at the end of the day, the change in the system comes from the change that the people drive. That's the only way the system comes. The change in the system comes, and the people that drive change are the people who are vested and committed and that believe in the power of the individual to make change. And so I think the work that you're doing is just great. I thank everybody else for being on here. And look, I've said it a lot, but I think that at the end of the day, one of the things that I believe very strongly in is don't watch what people say, watch what people do. Right? And I think I've said a lot today, and I think I'll just close it by saying that, I am actually walking the talk. I am doing things that I believe in, and I think that should speak to the fact that this is not academic. I think it is something that is very needed. Not just is it needed, we are seeing the effects of it. We are seeing that it's influencing government behavior. And in 2023, I ran for the governorship. I did not emerge. But today I'm impacting governance. I could have taken a different approach, and some of the effects that we're seeing from the work that we're doing, we would not have been seeing. But at the end of the day, I think Lagos is better for it. I think we can all find a way to remain engaged. And ultimately, what we're seeking is a good outcome for the people. I think about the millions of people who don't have a voice. So when we talk about voice, that's what you want to think about. Think not just about you, but when you are speaking, there's probably a million people who are benefiting from that thing that you are saying. You know, if what that thing that you are saying yields a result, there may be a million people that might benefit from it. And those people don't have voice. They are beaten down. They are struggling to eke out a living every day. They are disconnected from the system. And when you speak for them.
Thank you very much. So profound, so impactful. And on this note, we sincerely want to thank you, sir. Thank you for your time this evening. Thank you for sharing with us. It has been, for me, a thoroughly enjoyable time. I have learned a lot. My notes are full. But more importantly, you've been able to emphasize that our voice can transform. So we need to take away these mindsets that it's not possible, it won't work. No, you're walking the talk. You're a model, and I know many others have been influenced tonight by just some of the things you've shared with us. So once again, on behalf of the AGID team, we want to say thank you very much, and on behalf of everyone listening tonight, thank you very much for your time, and we'll certainly be in touch, sir.